So I think the first thing I'm going to do is add some of these like large machines. I might move the boat. And I'm really only doing this because what these elements do is they really block out um, what I don't need to build. So I think it's important to kind of establish that. So this little toggle here changes my gizmo from its relative position, so the relative position to the object itself, or to the world position, right? So world X, Y, and Z, right? So I'm going to select my cargo ship. I'm going to hit F. Oh, I can't focus on that. I'm going to hit select a part of my cargo ship. I'm going to hit F to focus on it, right? So I already kind of rotated it, and this is trying to emulate my scene from Dunkirk here, right? And so I just want like this creepy cargo ship that's been abandoned to occupy this space. So again, I'm gonna use world positioning just so I can move this into X, Y, and Z. And then I'm just gonna start dragging this over. You could see that there's a shadow that's remaining. That's from the light build. Remember, light building is just painting the shadows onto these surfaces, right? And so what might be also helpful is to set up a couple of cameras, um, if for anything else, just to make it so that we can kind of frame our views more deliberately and more easily, right? And I'm just kind of using the F key, so selecting an object and hitting F to focus on these things, right? So what I might do is add a Cine Camera, right? I like using Cine cameras because I can start to change aspects of the camera, um, like um, like I could change lenses, I could add a lot of depth of field, and I can just sort of like frame images, and they could actually be quite useful if you're going to eventually render using this, like render still images from the scene. If you sort of use these cameras in an effective way, you can just turn those camera views into renderings, right? And so what I generally like to do is set my film back to DSLR, and this represents the focal length or the type of lens you're using, right? We can change or the actual focal length of the current lens, right? So this universal zoom allows you to do a 4 millimeter lens, which would be like super, super wide angle. So if we sort of went down to 4, you can see how wide angle and distorted that is. Or it allows us to go all the way up to 1000 millimeters, which would be like super, super telephoto, right? And so this is just kind of set up so you can change your focal length to whatever you would want to be, right? And so for those photographers out there, 50 millimeters is kind of like the middle of the road, or like what you would see true to life. In other words, what you're seeing through the viewfinder is going to be at the same size as what your eyes are actually seeing. So this is like right in the middle between wide angle and telephoto. When going to wide angle, I really wouldn't go lower than like a 24 millimeter lens, right? If we want, we can select our camera actor. While with our camera actor selected, I can go into, I think if I do this, yeah. If I select the Cine Camera actor, I can actually move my camera just by flying around in it, right? And so, I want to kind of establish a view that's similar to, where was it? Like this view here. So seeing some of the berm, seeing some of the wall, and then really seeing where that boat is. So I might do something like this. If you want to get really cinematic with it, you can start to crop in some. This might be nice for renderings. Right, little war machine with nature. Anyway, you can tell like this is pretty nice, right? So I might crop this as an image, and then I'll start composing this. So once you've set your camera's position, um, we can eject to get out of it. And what I'm gonna do is select my camera again, and here I could just pin my camera, right? So now if I select my boat or my cargo ship, I can still see the camera and I can start moving things around and get it to where it, or to compose my scene in a way that makes sense. I don't want it to be too close because it's sort of like, well, you know, what it seems like it gets in the way. And so I'm going to try to compose my scene in a way that makes sense, right? You can follow like the rule of thirds and things like that. Um, and so let's lower my boat a little bit so it's kind of like embedded. And here I could even use my virtual texturing material to blend this thing, but I'm going to be far enough away from it where it's not really going to make a difference, right? So I think I like that. The other thing you might want to do with your cameras is to make it, and you could tell when I kind of clicked on this, it starts to get overblown. The reason that is this camera has kind of like an adaptive um, exposure. And so what we would want to do is go into the exposure. Let's see if I can remember where it is. Um, rendering features, film. Sorry, I don't remember where it is. Um, exposure. Why isn't this being exposed? No. Let's take a look here. I think it should be under post processing. Oh, sorry. I just have to click on this downward. Sorry about that. So with the lens selected, go to the exposure, and you just want to set your max and min to be the same value, right? So let's set this to 1 and 1 and see what that gets us. And so this is just kind of a standard exposure setting. If you want higher exposure, I think you put like a lower number and you can start to increase the exposure. The exposure is like a calculation of how long the shutter is open when you're taking the actual picture. It doesn't work exactly the same way as a camera in sort of the digital world of Unreal. So it's not like you're using a value like 1/50 or 1/100, etc. And so you just kind of adjust the numbers. I would start with 1 and go up and down as you see fit. But the key thing to take away from here is that you set these two values to be the same. Okay. The other thing about Cine cameras that are really nice is I'm just gonna pilot the camera again just so it's filling the entire screen, right? And I'm just gonna be careful not to move my position because I like the position where it is, right? And so for those of you again who are photographers, you can change things like depth of field by adjusting the f-stop on the camera, right? You can add things like bokeh, which are like the little bubbly, blurry circles in some images that you see. And if there's an opportunity for me to show you what that is, I will do so. But here, the thing I want to show you is how do you focus your camera, right? And so one is open this focus settings drop down arrow and click on this to draw the default, or sorry, the debug focus plane. And we can start to pull this closer and closer. And what this is doing is it's telling me where my camera focus is, right? So if I wanted to focus on this totem, I would set it somewhere over there. And if I wanted to focus on something like maybe that's more in the foreground that I haven't put into the scene yet, I could do that as well. But this is going to help guide your, where your camera is actually focusing. And you could also do like an autofocus where you can track a moving object. So if I did tracking and I can select a static mesh or an actor in my scene to follow. So if I had like an AI character and I want to use that character as my focal plane, I can just connect my tracking focus to that character, right? But what we're going to do is manual, and I could also just, click on an object, right? By hitting this eyedropper and selecting on the object, and it'll just move my focal plane to that, so I don't have to fiddle with the actual distance, right? So this is really nice because now I'm going to turn off the focal plane because I could change my aperture, and as I lower my aperture, right, so a 1.2 lens would be kind of crazy wide, or crazy big, um, so meaning it captures a lot more light. The offset of capturing more light is like your focal plane becomes quite thin. So more of you have, what would you call it? Less depth, greater depth of field, right? So in other words, the parts that are in focus are much narrower, and the things ahead of that focal plane and behind that focal plane start to fall out of focus, right? So the little dry grass here just got blurrier as I reduce my current aperture, but if I increase my current aperture, I have less depth of field, right? So a 22 setting on a lens would be like a pinhole camera, right? And so then more of the stuff in the frame is going to be in focus, right? Playing with depth of field, if you're a photographer, you probably already know all of this, but depth of field is actually really quite nice because making things out of focus actually makes it look more real. And when you're talking about photoreal, keep in mind that you're trying to make it look like it's something captured by a camera, and cameras have a certain amount of depth of field regardless of what you're dealing with, what kind of lens you're using, or how you're capturing, right? That's just a limitation of light going through a lens, right? The other thing to note is that the more telephoto my lens is, right, the more depth of field is going to be apparent. So like the stuff behind here just got much blurrier. You can see where my focal plane is along this, somewhere along the position of the robot. In fact, if we look at the sand, we can get a sense of where that focal plane is. And then everything in the foreground is blurry as well, right? And so the effective depth of field, like, or the effects of the depth of field are much greater if you're using a telephoto lens as opposed to a wide angle lens. Um, and I don't know the physics behind that. It has just to do with the field of view, and the appearance of depth. I think what's blurry and what's not is the same. It's really just the telephoto lens lets you zoom in on that, and so you get a greater sense of depth of field. So you change your focal length here, which is the length of the lens, right? Remember 50 is the middle of the road, and then everything above that is telephoto, um, and everything below that is sorry, everything, or sorry, everything below that is wide angle. Okay, so I think I had this set to 24, and so I'm gonna leave this at that, and continue to change my composition a little bit. So let's exit this. I'm gonna pin this again. Oh, what happened? Why is it doing this? I guess this has nothing to do with the exposure, but my exposure should be set. Yeah, 0, 0. Okay. All right. And then the last thing I'll say about Cine Cameras is whatever you can do in a post-process volume, you could do that in a camera. So I can like add a post-process material to this camera so that everything that's viewed through this camera is going to, have the post-process material layered on top of it. I could change, settings like bloom and change the intensity of that bloom, right? So I start to get like that dreamy look if I wanted to. I wouldn't overdo it with bloom, even though it starts to maybe be a fun thing to play with. But just again, don't be too heavy-handed with these post-processing effects because they start to distract from the actual scene. One thing you may want to note of this is if you are using Unreal to just render, convolution bloom is much more accurate than the standard bloom. If you're just doing an animated scene or a gaming environment, just keep this standard. But if you are going to render, you would probably want to switch to convolution. But those are all you really need to know about that. So I think these are mainly the things you would start to change. You could augment your depth of field without using the camera settings. I think you could just start changing and applying blur to specific distances here as well. But I just prefer doing it the film way just because I'm familiar with it. And then you could add things like lens flare. This you're really not going to see until you're looking directly at a light source. But you can go J.J. Abrams if you want to with this stuff. But again, try to not be too heavy-handed when it comes to these things. Okay? And then the last thing is color grading. This is like the white balance of your scene, so you could always like warm things up or cool things down depending on like what you might want. Like if I want to capture like something a little bit more retro and I want a bit of a sepia tone, I could start to change my color temperature of at least this particular camera anyway. All right, but I'm going to leave that alone. I'll probably do all of these types of changes after I've already composed my scene, just so um, uh, yeah, it's just better to do it so because the view is going to be affected by all of the things that you put into it. So yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and recompose this and keep working on it and then come back and start showing you how I blocked off my scene using props and then start working on some of the other list items that I have in my sketches. Okay.